Hey, John, good morning again. Welcome to our next Lean Pulse podcast session. You had a topic this morning you wanted to talk about slices. And tell me
Thin
more.
slices. Yep.
Thin slices. Tell me more.
Well, so right now I'm working on that typical household maintenance thing. Everybody's got a deck. Every once in a while you have to sand it, stain it, etc. So in doing it, and by the way, yeah, I've got a presentation on this from when I originally did it several years ago. But today I'm out there and I'm staining. And so to get to the point where I'm staining, it's just the rails. I'm not on the deck yet. You have to figure out if you can't do it all at once, whether it's weather or time or work, whatever, you got to figure out how you're going to slice the work in order to get it to fit into the time box. Well, there's always constraints. We've always got non-functional requirements that are constraining our system. So right now, I live outside of Denver. Right now, yesterday we got to 103 at my place and really low humidity. And
Things
I've
dry
got
very
work.
fast.
It dries, it evaporates. It doesn't just
Yeah.
dry, it's gone, which I can comment on is from today's. So I've been slicing, and today when I was staining, and no, I don't get it all done in one time because you got to do it before it gets too warm. Oh, and stain says less than 90 degrees and not in direct sunlight. So all these things you got to keep in mind. Those are NFRs,
All those constraints.
non-functional requirements, right? Everybody, what are non-functional requirements? It's the thing that constrain your product development, the stuff you're doing. So we've got NFRs everywhere. So anyway, that's the discussion. And then tie it into slices of features and stories and stuff like that.
And that's a very passionate topic for me because as like I like to say, recovering software engineer, I had to learn that firsthand. And I do say had to, because the impulse is, well, we've got all this stuff to do. Let's do all of this first, then let's do all of this, then let's do all of this. The problem is you lose so much opportunity to pivot, connectivity to what you're trying to do, the feedback loops, all of those things, you lose those things. And what I learned to do very quickly was create a shell, a shadow almost of what it is we're trying to accomplish. And when it comes to the code I was writing, there were an awful lot of components within it that were empty modules, null sets, whatever, that would basically return a hard-coded value because I just wanted to see what would this look like running in a happy path case. And that applies to a small effort, even to a bigger effort. I want to share this image because this is where a lot of people say, oh my gosh, how would you thin slice this down? So I don't know if you've ever been to the northern coast of Ireland, the Antrim coast, the absolutely beautiful Northern Ireland, I should be politically correct, absolutely beautiful. To build this bridge across, how do you do a thin slice? Well, how do you not do it with a thin slice? You're going to put that first rope across. And how you get that across and anchor it. And now you can start to move tools and things across. You put the second rope across and you start to realize, oh, wait, maybe we should have moved it down the hill just a little bit. There's a better angle. It's early on. You still can absolutely do that. And then as you start to add more to it, you say, okay, what if we add two more ropes up above with those posts so that we can start to see what the shape's going to look like? Not only that, we can somewhat safely get across it. We can convey tools across and things. All right, now let's worry about how do we get some platform that we can walk on to get across and continuing to slice that problem down. And even with the thin slice for that first rope, that's a fairly major undertaking. Getting a rope heavy enough to go across, does it have to be the rope? What if we shoot a line across, just a lightweight line, so we can use that to convey the heavier rope across? And I use that concept all the time in my software engineering practice is let's get that light line shot across there first, and then we can build on top of that half of the time, maybe more. Although I always believed in the adage that if I wrote it, it worked great. Not always true. But get that slender line shot across that chasm, that opening, and see, does this make sense? And if so, then we build on top of that.
Yeah, and in doing my deck, and again, my rails, not my deck, because the deck is the flat part. So I've only been working on the rails. So Saturday and Sunday, again, it was 95, 98 degrees. And I spent those days because I had time and I could do it throughout the day, scraping and sanding and repairing some wood. I, there's always maintenance to do, but this is production support, so to
Mhm.
speak. And as I was got to the point where I was staining. So my first day of staining was yesterday. I only had a couple hours because those NFRs I mentioned. And I took one section, about 8 foot wide between two posts, and just did that both inside and out, top, every side. But it was really slow because of ladders involved. And so I was going ladder to deck and upstairs and, all that kind of stuff. So today I changed my approach. My slice was different. And I did the whole top rail all the way around. And then the 2x4, the so to speak, like a jack stud that goes underneath that top rail, and then the bottom rail. And it went so much quicker because it was no ladder work. In other words, I wasn't moving a
Mm.
ladder every time, and it went a lot faster. But then I started thinking about what would I do if I had a time constraint and my wife wanted to do a barbecue and invite friends. So it had to look at least different, because that's where we get into is where do we have value? And I thought,
Yeah,
well, gosh, if I had to plan for that and there was this additional constraint coming in, I would figure out probably the top rail because people are going to set drinks on it. They're going to touch it. That would be a thin slice. And then maybe the rails going up the staircase because everybody's going to notice them because you're walking upstairs. But there's other rails on other parts of the deck that wouldn't be as meaningful. And so when I started thinking about it, even just doing something as simple as a deck, there's ways to slice it differently that always make it usable. And it's not out of reality that says, hey, maybe we want to use it. And if you did a whole, if you power washed and scraped and sanded everything first, your deck is essentially unusable for as much time as you've got. And
right.
this is going to take me a total of about 3 weekends the way that I do it. So, we've got to figure out how do we do that in code and in hardware. And by the way, hardware is a different discussion. There's so many people talking about agile for hardware, safe for hardware now, but we have to realize when they're talking that, we're really talking really R&D, because it's really not agile hardware as in building a hardware thing. It's saying, how are we creating specs for that hardware? So it's a different discussion.
Yeah. I want to bring up another analogy for you, and we'll stick to the deck concept. But I'm building, finishing a property out in a valley outside of Las Vegas. And one thing we had to do was to build a really large deck. It's 70 feet long, 14 to 16 feet at various levels. But there's certain things you have to build as that underlying infrastructure, that solidity. You cannot do it without having that in place first. So this is a picture of the forms that we had to create to hold the posts. And we're going to put post brackets on top of that. But you have to get those perfect, because if they're out of plumb, if they're not in line, the deck supports are not going to work correctly. But once you start to get those in place, and even that involves experimentation, because as you are learning, as you're building out those, you're adjusting as you go. The point of no return, that last responsible moment, is
Or in
starting to pour
concrete.
the cement, pouring concrete. Absolutely. But then you get to this point where now you can stand up that first post. That again is a learning experience. Are you going to establish all of the posts all at once? Absolutely not, because it's also a learning experience, how to best brace it, getting the right distance, the right height, the right, making sure it's perfectly plumb and square with the property. Now you're starting to get some infrastructure in place. You're starting to see some value. Yes, as a framer, you can walk on it. You're relatively comfortable. It's not braced. You notice there's no ridge board out in it or anything, but you can get out there and start to use it. But what you're really trying to strive for, you're shooting for this. This is the first time we actually, as a crew, got to sit on the deck. Now, we're on the very edge of the deck. In fact, where I'm taking the picture, I'm standing on open boards, and the other three are sitting on the first deck boards we put in place. You can't get to that point unless you do those right level of thin slices, but you're also having those moments of least of That last decision point where you have to decide where are the blocks for the cement going to go to support the post? How tall are the posts going to be? There are decision points you have to make. The problem is we make those way too early. We
Hey,
start to
Dwayne,
build those out right away.
when y'all were sitting out there, had you
Mhm.
decided on your posts yet what your post for your railing was going to look like, or was
No,
that still emerging?
great point. Nope, we had not decided that yet. We were thinking about different options. And what we did is we made sure. Now, that's the biggest deck I've ever built. I have built other decks. It's the largest I've ever built. There were a lot of questions. This is a very windy environment. It can get very hot in the summer. You mentioned 103. I think it was 115 there yesterday.
Hot.
So, yes, and the dry heat. So not only what kind of railing, but what's going to withstand the heat. And one of the things we had been talking about is rather than using the balusters, traditional more wooden or metal balusters, is using cabling, horizontal cabling through the posts. Okay, that sounds like a great idea. When do we have to actually decide on that? We can wait because the only thing you have to do to get that working is drill holes through the posts. Oh, so we have to drill holes through the posts. Means it's going to be a lot easier if we use wooden posts. Will wooden posts stand up to the summer, to the heat? Let's go find out. Let's go learn. We still had not decided on wooden versus metal post to support the railing and the top rails and so forth because we didn't have to yet. We weren't at
It-
that point of we had to make a decision.
when you decided on the cabling, at that point in time, when you decided on the cabling, did you automatically know whether you were going to use 3/16, quarter, 5/16, or
No,
whatever size of cable, diameter of cable?
nope, nope. We were still researching, we were still learning. And that's when we bring this back to development. You talk about continuous delivery pipeline. When we show that diagram, people are asking, well, how can you explore while you're integrating, while you're deploying? Just like that. We are deploying the foundation for the post. We're starting to integrate building the posts up, but we're exploring what kind of deck material, what kind of railing, and which one of those do we need to know first? Deck material, because the posts and the railing can come afterwards. Will they be an integral part of it? Absolutely. But that's that, hey, we're kind of targeting down this, so we're good. And we get into software engineering, far too often we try to set all of those things right up front. Well, what if we get to that point and realize, oh, we went with metal posts, are going to be really hot, they'll fade in the sun. Oh, too bad. We've already purchased those. What if we'd already decided we're using wooden spindles and we buy a few of them and then they run out of stock? Oh, now we can't get the spindles. Okay, that's where delays come in product development is we make these decisions way too early.
So on those decisions, Dwayne, and again, I thought about this morning as I'm staining. Here's the thing: people do this every day in their real life. They just don't apply it to
Mm,
work. And so as I'm staining part of the rail, and
right.
I could point out exactly where I was standing because I was looking at a tree and thinking, ah, that's here's a thought. So here I am staining, and we did it the same color, but when we choose a color, so my wife will say, she'll go to Sherwin-Williams, grab a bunch of paint swatches, come and look at them, throw a bunch of them out, and say, here's three. We go buy those little cans and we paint a big enough section to see if this color works. With the realization, if it's not selected, we got to paint over it. But that's a functional exploratory story or feature. For me, it's a exploratory story. It's really an exploratory task as part of a story because it just takes me a little while to put up a 4x4 area and paint in there and then peel off the tape and say, here's sample A, here's sample B, here's sample C, and let her choose. But we're doing that kind of stuff on set-based design all the time. We just don't apply it to work.
Why do you think that is? Why don't you mentioned that it happens in our personal lives all the time.
Oh, I've got
What
millions of examples too.
where's the switch that we flip that we lose that ability? We implement continuous delivery pipeline, that approach in our life all the time. Why do we lose that in the business world?
Because it's so ingrained. Everybody's so ingrained in their, I'm going to use the word traditional, I could
Yeah.
use current, but their traditional methodology, regardless of what it is, and people, whether it's good words or bad words, but their traditional methodology, they were successful. They're making money today. Let's be honest. Anybody listening to this is in a business that is making money today. So they're reasonably successful. Why not keep doing it the way we do it? Yet at home, we experiment. We as people are experimenters by nature. We try stuff out. Hey, that worked. That didn't
Yeah.
work. And so then we go to work and somebody says, well, here's a deadline. Give me all your decisions. By then we get a point solution.
Well, let's address that because you brought up something that a lot of people listening to this might challenge and say, no, I'm in government. That's not how we work. We're not about making money. But are you? Aren't you there funded to solve a customer problem? Taxpayers, warfighters, whoever they might be. It's not as different as we come across. And then we stop and look, well, look at all the regulatory. There are some things I've worked with clients that literally took an act of Congress to get changed. But guess
Well,
what? It can be changed. And that's what we lose sight of is we are locked into the current process we have. And this comes from leadership. Is leadership again focusing on getting a process that we lock into, and that's what we just keep doing all the time.
in talking about this, to me, it's flipping a switch. And can I share a couple of slides really quick just to show there's
Yeah.
two sides, but they're built up, so there's more images in that. But
Yeah.
just to share a couple things. And by the way, for everybody, this is in our it's our user story mapping stuff. For so when we're coaching people how to think user story mapping, by the way, everybody's got some sort of a stack. Whatever it is. That's not the important thing here, but everybody's got a stack. And in this one, we've got UI, we've got business services, we've got an ESB, business process, integration services, we've got data on the bottom, SAP, all this kind of stuff. That's a typical stack. It's just a
Yeah.
current state thing.
Relatively familiar. Yes.
So now think about this. As people are working, as they're thinking, there's a lot of folks who create requirements that cut through the horizontal layers of the stack. And that's an anti-pattern because that leads to that delayed integration, everything being having to wait until the very last thing to get integrated. By the way, I worked with a company and they had about 35 teams. They didn't listen to some of the things. 35 teams, they had a front end art and a back end art. And because it was set up like this, first off, we used two of those skeins of red yarn for the dependencies
Yeah.
because their features were written like this. And I'm going to get to that in a second. That's my second build-up slide. But it delays integration until everybody's done with everything. You can't make anything work. And so it leads to a bunch more integration at the end. And if we're talking, let's make it really simple. Let's say they could do this in a quarter. By the way, when you're doing it like this, most people take a project is like 9 months a year. So we're actually delaying longer. So these are anti-patterns. There's other anti-patterns for slicing stuff. But what we're talking about is these vertical slices, and that's a mind shift. It is literally flipping a switch to think, how could I do this? And that's what I was thinking when I was staining today. Oh, I could do it by sections. I could do the top. There's lots of different ways I could split the value if my wife wanted to have a barbecue and I had to respond in a fixed amount of time, a non-functional
Mhm.
requirement. So I don't have now just the NFR from weather and the NFR, or the weather isn't an NFR. The NFR on the back of the can of stain, 90 degrees, no direct sun and stuff like that. The current conditions, the environmental conditions, the weather. But now if we had that time constraint, we have to have this done by a milestone. I would say, what value do I have to show? What outcome do I have to make it decent? And it leads to a different answer. And I would have that conversation with my product owner or my
You,
product manager. Here, those blue things are representing features. So this
yeah.
idea of a feature is this thin slice through the whole architectural stack. And within that, teams are creating stories to support
Yes.
those vertical slices of features. But that getting to think like that takes a person who's open to ideas. They're ready to flip a switch and start saying, how could I do this differently? Kind of like I was thinking on my deck this morning.
So there's the guidance I want to leave for our audience before we wrap this one up. You've mentioned several times that switch that gets flipped. There was a client site I was going to in Kansas City, and it just dawned on me. I would walk in the door, and it hit me. People walk in this door and flip the switch, meaning they start thinking differently. Out on the street, what am I having for lunch? What? Hey, there's a good movie going on. What's a sporting event? What should the family do this weekend? We walk into that office and it's tell me what to do, tell me what to do. We become almost robots or just waiting for instructions. We have to bring back that approach of saying, what's the next best thing to do? And this graphic you're showing is perfect for it. Each of those green lines going through there is a learning opportunity. The blue rectangle can easily be shrunk or expanded sometimes based on what we learn from each of those thin slices through. And one thing I want to add, you're talking about deck staining. One thing I'm sure you know this as well, but when you're staining a deck, especially when it's wood, you have to have a continuous flow of that. Otherwise, you leave marks behind. I'm sure you've seen that. If you stain to a certain area and kind of end at about this, and then you come back in a couple hours and continue that on, you can see that in the finished product. So how do you keep that thin slice going through while still creating the right product, the right outcomes eventually?
Staying to the edge of the board. So again, keep in mind, I'm doing the rails now when I do the deck. So part of the strategy there is, so you look at the way your boards on your deck are laid, and you always have to stop at where the board ends. So if you're
Yes.
going to take a break, so I'm using a brush on the rails because I get better coverage with a brush. It doesn't take me that long. I've done a lot of painting and staining, so I'm doing a decent job from a time perspective. But
Mhm.
when I do the deck portion, I'm using a small roller that's just narrower than my board. So you get a little pad roller, you're rolling it out, touching up any spots that you missed. And so literally doing it a board. And if you do it a board at a time, if you got it like a checkerboard, you could do it like the checkerboard and go all the way along back and then to the next one. But it says you still have to plan it out. And you still have to take into
Yeah.
account the NFRs. What does the stain or paint say you've got to do, and the weather. And so real life experience when, I've got this in a presentation about tasking stories. So I
Yeah.
actually used my deck example in the past to talk about tasking. And if I had a decking company, it would be different than I'm doing it myself with a buddy or my son. But how would you talk about getting a deck done? So you're training somebody now because now you're doing it across more and more people. So if I had a decking company and I'm training different teams, the folks who go out and do decks everywhere, how we're going to do this so it looks good for our customers. Well, we do that with the same thought process. These are good things. And something really important, and I just thought of this, realize this doesn't include the idea of definition of done, because that plays into this too. When you're looking at a feature, all those stories have to be completed. And you've mentioned the continuous delivery pipeline a couple times. There's a lot more. It's not this cut and dry. These are just like some simple visuals to get people thinking about flipping a switch from horizontal based thinking to vertical slices of features and of course stories. And there's
Yeah.
lots more that goes into it, like always.
I want to wrap this one up with one more analogy to the deck staining concept. You brought up your wife and using the samples and things like that. The big issue we commonly have is the culture, the process, the structure, the way we work together, the system in our businesses. Business managers, stakeholders are used to seeing a completed deck. Tell me when it's done, and I will come and tell you if you did a good job or not. What we need them to do is come out, not only when we have that first deck stain, that's deck board. You mentioned that deck board. Well, you take one deck board, stain that whole board. You can get a pretty good idea what that color is going to look like, but you would have to replace that entire board if it's not the right color. Whereas if we can get business owners to come out on a regular basis and, hey, real quick, can you take a look at this? So I've just started to bread. In fact, I just opened the can and stirred it up and I put a little test on the back of this board. What do you think? Oh, that's the color it's going to look like on that board, that wood. I think we have the wrong color. Well, we already bought the stain. We have to use it. No, we don't. We go buy a different can of stain.
Yep. By the way, now think about, so you just a different experiment. we've always got boards left over.
Yeah.
If the manager said, I can't see with that small of a sample, I've got, X number of board feet out there. I could
Right.
create a little 3x3 square, nailed a 2x4s on the end. It doesn't have to be big. It's an experiment. Stain that. Now you got a 3x3 foot thing that says, here's the color. Set it right in the middle of the deck. Can you picture this now?
Yeah.
There's so many ways we can change our thinking.
And that's where we need to get business managers, product owners, product managers to get engaged at that level in that early learning process. That's how you start to change the culture around. And it will take time. They are used to coming to see a completed deck. And a lot of times saying, I wish the color was different. I wish we'd have done that, but it's all done now. Too late. No, we need to educate them on the advantages of coming earlier, short, quick visits to come and say, what do you think on this sample? Or even take the sample to them and just say, what do you think? Well, I need to see it outside but next to the deck. Yeah, you do. Let's go do a gimbal walk. Let's go see what it looks like in there. So I want to wrap this session up before we go too far with this one, but great conversation again. The bottom line really is you have to build a culture around this type of thinking. And we've talked about it many times. The only way to build a culture is to change the practices, change the process, change the approach of how you work. That's how you get this in place. So great conversation, John. Thanks. And we'll
Hey,
see you on
Dwayne,
the next
if
one. Oh,
somebody wants to
yes.
connect with us,
Oh,
what's our
yes.
email?
Thank you. Connect at leaningagile.com, and I will put that into the podcast briefing as well. So
Cool.
thanks, John.
Talk to you later.